Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. Today's episode is a conversation with Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo is a philosopher with a background in computer science, and he has PhDs in both disciplines. He's written 9 books, many of which are on the idea that only consciousness exists, and these include Rationalist Spirituality, Why Materialism is Baloney, and The Idea of the World. He's also a regular contributor to Scientific American, and in today's episode, we talk mainly about his idea that only consciousness exists, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I think a good place to start would just be with your background and kind of how you came to be interested in consciousness and idealism and all the related topics.
My original background is computer engineering. That was my first doctorate 19 years ago now. I've worked in places related to physics a lot. I've worked at CERN in Switzerland as an engineer, helping build the Atlas detector of the Large Hadron Collider. I've worked at Philips Research. Then I moved my daytime professional life to the entrepreneurial world. I founded a company, which is now part of Intel. And for the past 15 years, I have been doing corporate strategy in high tech in my daytime. But all my life, I have had an interest in philosophy, which went hand to hand with computer engineering when I was working on AI, artificial intelligence, which tends to get conflated with artificial consciousness, although these are two completely different things. Even I, my old self of 15 years ago, conflated these things of 20 years ago. And I do have a doctorate in philosophy as well, more recent. And my life now has taken a very recent shift to the world of philosophy of mind. It has now, from tomorrow on, it's my day job as well.
That's wonderful. Yeah, you mentioned that you're in the midst of a career change, so that's going to be full time from now on.
Yes, we are starting a foundation. I'm not alone in it. I have a very good friend doing this with me, Fred Matzer, a few other people. And we want to try to help make metaphysical idealism mainstream, because we think from a rational point of view, from an empirical point of view, it has every reason to replace metaphysical materialism as the mainstream.
Yeah, that's wonderful that you're spending all your time in it now. You've definitely had a good start with it over the last decade. You've written a huge amount of books on this stuff, right? So that's wonderful. So maybe jumping into your ideas, a good place to start would be with the current prevailing paradigm of materialism, just so everyone's up to speed on physicalism, materialism, whatever which your preferred term is. We can outline what that is and go on from there.
Yeah, you could call it mainstream metaphysical physicalism. That would be the official unambiguous name. We can call it materialism, so long as we don't mix it up with the material girls materialism, ethical materialism. We are talking about metaphysical materialism here. It's the idea that what really exists out there is unconscious matter, fundamentally unconscious, and certain arrangements of that matter somehow, in a way that nobody understands, give rise to consciousness as an epiphenomenon or as an ephemeral property. But consciousness is not fundamental. It's derivative, according to materialism. In essence, what materialists do, they start like all of us from perception, and perception is mental. And then they describe that perception, those perceptions, with certain quantities. Perceptions are qualitative. We perceive qualities. We describe those qualities with quantities, such as amplitude, frequency, mass, charge, momentum, spin, and so on and so forth. Having described that, materialists then say, but all that exists is actually the description. All that exists is the mass, charge, momentum, and the qualities, they are epiphenomenal. They are derivative from the quantities. So they invert it. They say what exists are quantities and qualities are derivative, even though, we start all from the qualities and the quantities are just descriptions.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of range of more or less sensible opinions I think you can take on materialism, right? There's all the way from the kind of naive, the world is made of hard stuff. And I think you and I would agree that's not what's going on. And I think something I know we've both written about is that science is in the business of describing processes and describing the behavior science itself, the scientific worldview, does not say what this stuff is in its essence, right?
That is correct. The scientific method is a way to investigate how natures behave. That's what experiments uncover. You set up some initial conditions, and then you observe how nature will react to that. That reaction is a behavior. So all scientific models are predictive models of what nature would do next, given certain initial conditions. They have nothing to say about what nature essentially is. That is beyond the scope of the scientific method, because experiment can't pin that question of being down. It can inform that question, but it cannot pin it down. The question of what nature is a question of philosophy, and philosophy is helped by science. It's informed by science, but you need more to converge to a reasonable hypothesis for what the nature of reality is. You need parsimony, you need logical consistency, coherent, empirical adequacy. There's a number of other things that you need to address metaphysics that go beyond the boundaries of the scientific method.
Yeah, I think this might be where our perspectives, where we're coming at it from slightly different places, as you're coming at it from this very serious philosophical, kind of ontological, what is the world made of perspective. And I always like to be reminded as a scientist to be humble, and that the job of science really is this process of coming up with a map, describing how things unfold, coming up with laws. You know, that's and that map never fully encompasses the territory. It never explains away existence. So I personally, yes, to kind of try to stay away from making hard claims around ontology. Yeah, which is great to have you here.
You are a true scientist. People who are real scientists understand this, and that's how they go about their work, because science is entirely metaphysically agnostic. You do not need to espouse any metaphysics to do good science. Actually, it is preferable that you don't, because if you espouse a metaphysics, chances are you will be unconsciously biased. Well, I don't like the word unconsciously because I don't think it doesn't exist, but you will be inadvertently biased. The people that you see most often on television preaching the gospel of scientific materialism as a metaphysics, if you look carefully, most of them are not really practicing scientists. They have a degree, but they spend their time and they earn their living talking about things, being visible. And I think they do a disservice to philosophy, certainly, because they babble garbage when they talk about philosophy, but also a great disservice to science, because if they get discredited, that may rub off on science, which would be very unfortunate.
Yeah, I think you're right that we live in a culture that has kind of valorized science to a point. I think because science is so tied up with engineering and material production and the generation of kind of material wealth. I think you're right that it culturally oversteps its mark, and we get people making claims about making metaphysical claims based on this powerful method. And yeah, it definitely means that I think a lot of people get turned off of science, when I personally don't feel they should be, because I think it's a wonderful tool in its place, not as an entire worldview.
Science is in my DNA. Since I can remember existing, my fascination for science has been there. My biggest dream when I was, I don't know, a 5-year-old kid, maybe 7, I don't know. My biggest dream was to one day work either for NASA or for CERN in Switzerland. So that was in the early 80s. People were still building the LEP, the older accelerator. You know, it was big news at the time. And working for CERN was my very first job. I defended my graduation thesis on a Friday. On a Sunday, I was in a plane. On Monday, I started at CERN. So yeah, my love affair with science has been, it's lifelong. I hope nobody misunderstands me in the sense of thinking that I am shooting at science. I'm not. I am shooting often at some self-appointed spokespeople of science who actually are not really talking only science. They are talking philosophy, very, very, very bad philosophy. And I think those people should be, how to say, exposed.
Yeah, I also think something that's really interesting in when you dive into your work is the way that it comes once you get into it and you understand what you're saying, science still stands. You know, it's not like, I think the first time you hear if someone says there's only consciousness, without going any further, you might think, okay, everything's a dream. It's some kind of, it's like in a dream, if something seems to be lawful, it's not really, it's just an imaginative kind of trick. But yeah, it's nice that you come around to bringing us back to where we kind of started in thinking like the laws of physics still apply. And
Oh,
yeah.
I recognize what you're saying because I've lived through this. When I say, well, my metaphysical position is that everything is mental, people think, oh, you think that everything is in your head. No, 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 that's materialism. Materialism says that the whole world of your experience is inside your skull. It's inside your head, and what is out there is purely abstract, only describable through equations. So I'm saying the exact opposite. I'm saying that the world of qualities that seems to surround us really does surround us. It's not inside our heads. It's really out there. That's the metaphysical position of saying that reality is mental, in essence. Just to be absolutely clear, to put it on the record, I don't repeat this often enough because for me it's self-evident. So I just don't come to remember that I should say this. My position does not invalidate anything in science, not one iota. On the contrary, I base my work on a lot of science, a lot of physics, a lot of neuroscience. If you look at my writings, my list of citations and references for scientific papers is rather extensive. So no, I'm not anti-science at all, and I'm very much to the contrary.
Great. So maybe a good thing before I get overexcited and just jump into presuming everyone knows about your perspective. Let's go kind of step by step and maybe start with your thoughts on the hard problem of consciousness, if that's where you perceive your thinking on this stuff to have begun.
Yeah, if I may just add to something I just tried to answer before. James, in fact, I am a reductionist naturalist. So I'm even more than pro-science. I'm very much a reductionist. I want to reduce everything to one. I just choose my reduction base differently than many other people, but I'm a reductionist and I'm a naturalist. I think what's happening out there is nature doing what nature does. It's not necessarily the outcome of a premeditated plan by some universal mind that knows what it's doing. I don't think that is the case. I am with Schopenhauer there. Yes, the world out there is mental, it's the will, but the will is blind. In other words, the will is instinctive. It is predictable. That's why predictive models in science work. Because the behavior of nature seems to be instinctive. It doesn't have the idiosyncrasies of a metacognitive conscious being that plans and premeditates. That doesn't seem to be what's going on. Now, the hard problem, just maybe I should just first summarize what the hard problem is. It basically says that there is nothing about mass, charge, momentum, spin, nothing about any material property, nothing about any physical quantity, in terms of which we could deduce, at least in principle, the qualities of experience. There is, people used to call it, before the hard problem became fashion, people used to call it the explanatory gap. There is a huge explanatory abyss between predicting how matter will behave, but trying to deduce the qualities of experience from the physical quantities. It is impossible even in principle. And that's a very vexing question. My perspective on that is that it is not a problem at all. It's not a real problem that needs to be solved. It's not a problem that exists out there at all. It's an artifact of bad thinking that happened long ago, became so internalized that it goes unexamined, and now we take it for granted because it has been around for so long, it gathered so much momentum that we don't see through it. And the bad step of thought was to replace reality with a description of reality, to replace the territory with the map. And the hard problem basically says, well, we cannot deduce the territory from the map. Well, guess what? Of course not, because the map is a description of the territory. The territory comes first, mind comes first, qualities come first. Quantities are a way to describe qualities, the relative differences between qualities. So, of course, we cannot deduce the qualities from those quantities because they are the description in the first place, not the thing from which qualities arise. So that inversion is what has led to the hard problem. It's not a problem, it's an artifact of metaphysical materialism. I think once you see through that, the problem just disappears. It doesn't need to be solved.
I feel like it's even more than an artifact of materialism, it's an artifact of a kind of implicit dualism. You're kind of saying that matter is some kind of substance that I think I know what it is. Mind is another kind of substance that I think I know what it is. And there's some mapping that needs to take place between the two, which I just think fundamentally isn't the right way of thinking about it. And the way to talk about consciousness, in my opinion, would just be to use the same mapping process, you know, when you map out phenomenology, and not try to explain it away, but you stick with what science does, which is offer descriptions of processes, and not try to go any deeper than that.
Beyond that, I think what you just said, you've pinned down a very, very common and very, very problematic thing that happens, which is this implicit dualism you're talking about. This catches people wrong-footed all the time, and they don't even know what they're doing. I can give you an example. When I'm having debates and I say, well, everything is mental. I'm not saying that everything is in your mind alone or in my mind alone. I'm saying that the world out there is constituted of transpersonal mental states, experiential states. That's what it is in and of itself. And it presents itself to us on the screen of perception as colors, flavors, and so on. And then people say, well, but that cannot be the case. That cannot be right, because matter influences mentality, and the direction of causality is very clear. If a surgeon goes with a material scalpel and cuts into your brain, something will happen in your conscious inner life. So how can idealism explain that? Because matter is influencing or determining the states of mind. So it cannot be all mind. So you see, that's the inconsistency of thought. That's the dualism raising its ugly head when you're not looking. If I'm saying that everything is mental, then that scalpel is also the image of a mental process. And that one mental process affects another mental process is trivial. Our thoughts impact our emotions, and our emotions impact our thoughts every day. So my position entails that when a surgeon holding a scalpel cuts into your brain, or when you drink alcohol, that material liquid, that physical liquid, they influence your conscious inner life because they too are mental processes which simply present themselves to your observation as the scalpel, as the alcohol. That's how they appear to you. But in and of themselves, they too are mental processes. And then, of course, they influence your conscious inner life because mental processes of different natures influence one another.
I feel like in I think this is something we're going to probably stick on a lot is this direction of causality, because I think that's something maybe I still struggle to kind of really, I'm sure there's a lot to say about it in your worldview. And also something I think that's interesting is you said, like, of course, mental events influence each other, right? And to the average person, or to just any human observing their mind, that feels trivial, that feels obvious, right? That you think of something and it triggers a memory, and that triggers an emotion. In the kind of mainstream science way of thinking about things, it's quite radical to argue that there's any causality in consciousness, right? I think, again, I mean, it's going to be hard to unpack this because we're dealing with two such different worldviews. But in the materialist worldview, or I should say maybe the mainstream scientific worldview, you would have something like, if I feel hungry, my mood is low, and I imagine dinner, and I imagine the smell of dinner as well. In my kind of way of thinking about, the scientific way of thinking about the world, your blood glucose is low, that triggers physiological processes, and the direction of causality, all those things kind of arise at the same time. There's a logic to them, they seem associated, but mental events don't have causal power. and our understanding of causal power is very much one of physics, right? So maybe, yeah, maybe that's a good place to go next in terms of your thinking about that.
I think you're correct. That's what mainstream materialism entails. It says experiential states have no causal powers, no causal efficacy. Many materialists who do not really understand what materialism is, although they defend it, they disagree with this. But that's because their understanding of materialism is skewed. They didn't really examine the implications of that worldview. I have one particular person in mind who's a particularly good example of this. The direction of causality is only important when you are thinking in dualist terms. And a lot of materialists think in dualist terms, even though materialism is a monist metaphysics. It has no room for dualism, but that's how people think for some reason. They think that mind is somehow distinct from matter, and mind therefore cannot have causal efficacy, because if it is distinct, it cannot influence matter. And then you have this whole discussion about, is the level of glucose in your blood that makes you feel hungry when it's detected by your brain, whatever. Forget dualism. There is no dualism. That's my position. The glucose in your blood, the cells in your body, your blood, your heart, all the physiological processes that present themselves to observation by scientists, they are the extrinsic appearance of inherently mental processes that are not available to introspection. They're beyond the reach of introspection, so to say, but they are mental. They are out there. So for me, it's a red herring, this discussion about the arrow of causality. It's a play of mind with mind. Causality is in mind. Of course, we can go deeper in that discussion and think, ask, is there really causality, or are these just correlations that are part of a much broader pattern? And because we only see a little bit of the pattern, we think in terms of causality. But let's not, we don't need to go that far to make a step forward. We have to abandon this unexamined, implicit dualist way of thinking about things for the sake of materialism and idealism, because both do not have room for it.
Yeah, I think we're probably likely to agree that any picture of the world that isn't monist doesn't consist of just one. I try to not talk about substances, as I said before. I try not to go to ontology, but any explanation that's fractured in some way into two is always going to be inelegant and not the final answer. So maybe it's worth laying out precisely your worldview as a kind of consciousness only worldview.
So in my view, all that exists are experiential states or mental states. I use these words as synonyms. Many people don't. That's why I make this disclaimer. All that exists are mental states, not your mental states alone, not my mental states alone. There are transpersonal mental states. So it is all experience. But experience has two perspectives. There is an intrinsic view to the experience, and there is an extrinsic appearance to the experience. Schopenhauer called it will and representation. Both are experiences, but they correlate with one another. For instance, if I feel fear while I'm lying in a functional MRI, the intrinsic view is the felt fear I have. The extrinsic appearance of that inner state, from the point of view of the neuroscientist looking at the monitor of the fMRI machine, will be certain patterns of brain activity. Now, those two are experiences of the neuroscientist, experiences of the neurosurgeon, or whoever is taking a peek into the private world of your mental states. So it's only experiences, but experiences correlate across points of view. So there is a, quote, dualism of perspective, but not a dualism of substance.
A dualism of perspective, can you go into that a bit more deeply?
Yeah, so if I'm lying in the fMRI brain scanner and I feel fear, my perspective is a first-person perspective. But my experience from a first-person point of view presents itself to the neuroscientist looking at the fMRI monitor, presents itself to him in another way, because he has a second or third person perspective. So there are at least two perspectives. And I think that arises from dissociation, but now we're going to the detail. We have to explain why there are two perspectives. If everything is one universal mind, we cannot escape the need to explain why two perspectives arise in one mind. So of course I get to that. That's the meat of my ideas. But the fact that there are different perspectives, an inner perspective and an outer perspective, does not entail or imply substance dualism. There are no two substances. There is only one substance. There is only experience, but experience is perspectival.
I see. So the dualism is there's the experience of felt states, but there's also the experience of perceiving a world with structure. So which is kind of like saying physics is actually a perceptual act.
Physicists who think a little bit more deeply about what physics is, I will cite one specific example. André Linde wrote extensively about it. He insists physics is a science of perception. That's what it is. Let us not forget where we came from, how it all started. We start from perceptions, and then we start modeling the behavior of those perceptions. And then it becomes very convenient at some point to imagine that there is some underlying reality outside of us that would give us a way to think about why those perceptions are behaving this or that way, and we create some laws and so forth. But it all starts from perception. See, I don't reject that there is a world out there that we are all immersed in. That's why we describe our world in such a mutually consistent manner. I'm just saying that that world is not constituted by quantities, by something that is exhaustively defined in quantitative terms. I reject that, because then you face the hard problem. This world out there is constituted by transpersonal experiential states that present themselves to you according to what appears on the screen of perception. But perception is also mental. So there's mentality out there and mentality in here, and there's a correspondence between them, those two perspectives, but it's all mentality.
So maybe that's a good place to go to the this idea of dissociation, right? So you were saying out there is transpersonal thoughts, which might sound, if you start from our perspective and then say that might sound quite like a leap. But if you come from the view of there's only, in the first instance, there's only cosmic consciousness or mind at large, and then this dissociation happens. Is that how it, or maybe, yeah.
I will use a time metaphor. I don't necessarily mean this literally, because the status of time in physics is very questionable these days. So I don't want to get pinned down on that. So it's a metaphor. Let's imagine that in the beginning, there was only one spatially unbound consciousness, universal consciousness. There are many names. Some New Age people prefer cosmic consciousness. I don't have any problem with that name. Cosmic refers to the cosmos, and yeah, that's what I mean. So I'm fine with that, although that name has gained a bad rap for some reason. I will use universal consciousness here. So that's how it starts. So there are no two perspectives within that one universal consciousness. You can imagine it as your own mind if you are within an ideal sensory deprivation chamber. So you have no perception. You don't hear anything, you don't see anything, you don't feel anything, touch your skin, nothing. All you have are your endogenous mental states. Now, extrapolate that many orders of magnitude, and then you have the original state of universal consciousness, having endogenous experiential states. There are no two perspectives there, as you don't have two perspectives in that ideal sensory deprivation chamber. You experience your thoughts and your emotions from a first person perspective. There is no second or third person. Now, I think what happened, again, within the time metaphor, is that at some point universal consciousness underwent dissociation. Now, this is not an appeal to abstraction. We know dissociation happens. We've known it at least since the late 19th century, although there were skeptics of in strong dissociative states. People were skeptical. Some people were skeptical of them until the second decade of the 21st century. Until very recently, people were saying, well, these people with dissociative identity disorder, they are attention seekers, they are pretending, it doesn't really exist. Your mind cannot seemingly break up into different personalities that don't like each other or don't have mental access to one another. It's impossible. Well, thanks to neuroimaging over the last 10 years or so, we know that, hey, it does happen, okay? There have been neuroimaging studies in which people with dissociative identity disorder were scanned, and actors pretending to have dissociative identity disorder, pretending to themselves, and that's actor training. You have to adopt that perspective in your inner life as well, not only behave accordingly. So actors were playing that game and they were scanned, and guess what? Dissociative identity disorder, the real thing, looks very different under a brain scanner. There was a phenomenal study in 2015 in Germany. A woman with DID had an alter that claimed to be blind. And so they hooked her up to MEG, I think, or an EEG. I don't remember exactly. And her host personality was in control. There was normal activity in her visual cortex. But when the supposedly blind alter was in control, activity in the visual cortex just disappeared, even though her eyes were wide open. Now, you cannot fake that, right? Dissociative has a literally blinding power. It is literally blinding. So, okay, we know dissociation happens and it can create the appearance of multiple co-conscious centers of consciousness that are disjoint from one another. We know this happens. I'm just extrapolating and saying, well, this happened to universal consciousness. Oh, why did it happen? Why would consciousness do that? Remember, I'm a naturalist. It happened because this is what happens in nature. Nature is such that this shit happens. Too bad. I don't think it was premeditated. I don't think it was planned. It just happened. And the moment that happened in science, we call the moment of abiogenesis, the creation of life from non-life. I think living beings, metabolizing organisms, are the extrinsic appearance of dissociated mental states, the extrinsic appearance of an alter. That would be the psychiatric term. When you are a dissociated personality of a host, they call you an alter personality, an alter consciousness, whatever, alternative. I think we are all alters of universal consciousness. The fact that we are alive is the image of that dissociation. When we die, dissociation ends, we are reabsorbed into this ground level of reality. And metabolism is just what dissociation looks like from across its dissociative boundary. As a matter of fact, matter is what experiential states look like from across a dissociative boundary. Because when I look at the inanimate universe, I'm looking at it from across my own dissociative boundary. I am an alter. I have a dissociative boundary. That boundary looks in perception like skin, eyes, ear, nose, and tongue. That's the appearance of my dissociative boundary on the screen of perception. So I'm looking across my dissociative boundary into the transpersonal experiential states of the inanimate universe. And what do I see? I see matter. Now, it's not a coincidence because when my inner life presents itself to a neuroscientist operating a brain scanner, that presentation also happens in the form of matter, or to a neurosurgeon operating my brain. My inner life presents itself from across its own dissociative boundary as matter. So I would go as far and say, this is what matter is. It's what experiential states look like from across the dissociative boundary. And life is the image of a dissociative process in universal consciousness.
Yeah, so when you say we, you're talking about all life, right?
All life.
Not just humans, all living processes. And as a scientist, I guess I'm intrigued as to whether in this worldview there's a way to get insight into the relationship between between mind and its extrinsic appearance, right? Like in science, you'd think about the kind of the lawful unfolding of the physical and then how that maps onto the experiential states. If the experiential states are primary, I guess I'm wondering why does dissociative mind look like metabolism?
Why do stars shine? Why does the moon go around the earth? Um, Again, I'm a materialist. Sorry, I am a naturalist. I'm a naturalist. The fact that I'm not a materialist does not preclude me from being a reductionist and a naturalist. Nature is what it is. It does what it does because its behavior is the unavoidable consequence of what it is in and of itself. And nature seems to be such that when universal consciousness dissociates, it looks like life. Look, it had to look like something, right? It had to have an appearance. It had to look like something. And it so happens that what it looks like is what we've labeled life. So it's not, it's not a big thing that I'm proposing. I'm just interpreting the names we've given. What we call life is that, in my view. That's all there is to it. Now,
I
okay,
guess
but
that's sorry.
You asked more. Sorry, I failed to answer your question properly. You're talking again about the correlations of inner mental states and their appearance as matter, as metabolism. Well, I would say they correlate because one is the image of the other. The image of a phenomenon has to correlate with it because it's the image of it. It's what it looks like. So of course it correlates with it. Some people would criticize that by saying, well, but I have no accessible experiential state that correlates with my right big toe. We know that my consciousness correlates with certain patterns of brain activity, not even all of them. So how do you account for the liver, the stomach, and my right big toe? And the problem here is that the claim is that all there is phenomenal consciousness. The claim is not that all there is meta-consciousness. And there is a very, very important distinction between the two. Phenomenal consciousness means an experiential state. If there is something it is like to be in that state, it doesn't matter what. If there is anything it is like to be in that state, then that is a phenomenally conscious state, an experiential state. Meta-consciousness requires more than that. To be meta-conscious, you need to have an experience and know that you have the experience. So there are two experiential states here. One is an access conscious, phenomenal and access conscious state, and the other one is raw consciousness. So when you feel pain, first you feel the pain, and then you experience the knowledge that you feel the pain. That's metacognition, conscious metacognition, or metaconsciousness for short. All you can report is what you're metaconscious of. If you are not metaconscious of an experience that you are having, you cannot report even to yourself that you are having that experience. And this may sound like, wow, some bizarre thing, very implausible. It's extraordinarily plausible if you just stop and pay attention. For instance, you have been conscious of your breathing since we started talking, but you have not been meta-conscious of your breathing since we started talking. Now you are, because now I brought your attention to it. So you introspect, you re-represent that in your mind. So now you experience the air flowing through your nostrils, the inflation of your rib cage. Not only that, now you experience the knowledge that you are experiencing that. And then you form memory pathways and all that. A lot of people conflate consciousness with meta-conscious and it's consciousness. And it's important to distinguish them. It happens very often to men, not to women, that they experience pain, but they are not metacognitive of that experience. They are in pain, but they don't know. If you ask them, are you in pain? They say, no, it's okay. But if you help them breathe, relax, let's do a relaxation exercise, just focus in your body, feel your toes, move a little bit around, feel your butt on the chair. No, calm down. Do you feel pain? Oh, shit. Oh, yeah, it's hurting a lot. So because we've become so abstract in our thinking, we live in our heads. We don't live in our bodies anymore. We've lost touch with the experiential states whose image is the rest of the body. And even the science of consciousness can't study that for as long as it depends on report. for many years, the neuroscience of consciousness adopted the so-called report paradigm. If the person reported a state, a mental state, then it was conscious. Otherwise, it was unconscious. Well, guess what? Since 5 or 6 years, we have the no report paradigms in neuroscience, because neuroscientists woke up to the fact that the neurocorrelates of consciousness that they had before were not at all the neurocorrelates of consciousness. They were the neurocorrelates of consciousness, the states that could be reported, that could be introspectively accessed and mentally re-represented. So now they are a little bit sharper, and people realize, even things like blind sight, such a mystery thing, people act as though they could see. Now, if you throw something at them, they get out of the way. But if you ask them, can you see this? No, I'm completely blind. Yeah, guess what? They can't report the experience of seeing. And that has to do with some connections here at the back of the brain between the visual cortex and the more primitive areas underneath. Anyway, details. If you understand that distinction, then you understand idealism.
Yeah, I would hold the same thing. I was surprised that I think we've both written effectively the same stance on this, that the unconscious isn't really unconscious, it's just differently conscious and inaccessible. And I've also written this complaint that when people look for the neural correlates of consciousness, they're often looking for the correlates of this kind of, the parts of the brain where there's kind of language and reportability, and the self is being modeled, and that's kind of misdirected the search for the neural correlates of consciousness. Because the plants can't tell us if it's conscious, we're not looking there for its correlates of its consciousness, right?
I think the error is a very old one. I would claim it started with Freud, maybe even the predecessors of Freud. I don't know. Maybe what was his name? Dr. Breuer, the mentor of Freud. And late in the 19th century, it started. And it started innocently because they've chosen a word, the unconscious, that leads to all this confusion. If you read the texts of the founders of depth psychology, I've been a student of Jung, Carl Jung, for Carl Gustav Jung. In the English word, we don't pronounce the second name, but in the German world we do pronounce the second name. For almost all my life, since I was 14, when a book by Jung landed in my hands. I have read his collected works multiple times. I wrote a book about Jung that's coming out next year. If you read his writings, he's absolutely clear, consequent, and consistent in his definition of consciousness. It is not what we call phenomenal consciousness. It is a subset of that, a subset that has enough associative links, that is accessible through metacognitive introspection. And there was a third, I'm not going to get into that because it would take a long while to explain the third criterion he had. So when he said the unconscious, he didn't mean really unconscious. What he meant is dissociated and introspectively inaccessible. And it's not, you don't need to be a medium to understand that that's what Jung meant, because he wrote it. He wrote it in a very unambiguous way. It's right there. He just went along with Freud and used this very confusing word, the unconscious. It's unfortunate. Jung was an idealist, by the way. I make that case in my book.
So I look forward to reading that. So you've written as well that I think a lot of, sometimes when people put forward idealist ontologies, they're accused of there being a kind of reverse hard problem. And I think you hold that your version doesn't suffer from that, right?
No, hard problem arises from a kind of dualist thinking, which is forced upon materialists because they can't make sense of experience. So some kind of dualism is forced into them. I don't think there is the opposite problem at all. There is no hard problem of matter for idealism, because there is no such a thing as matter defined exclusively in quantitative terms. It doesn't exist. Those quantities are descriptions. They're not the thing in itself. All you have is mind from the get-go. What is matter? Matter is a particular modality of experience, namely perceptual experience. You also have thoughts, you also have emotions, you also have abstract thinking, you have fantasies. Matter is one of these modalities, what presents itself to you on the screen of perception. That's all there is to it. There is only one important problem for analytic idealism, and that is the decomposition problem. How does one mind seemingly become many? That's a legitimate problem. But the way to solve it is through dissociation, which is not even a theoretical invention. And nature is giving us the clues around. People undergo dissociation all the time. Mild forms of dissociation we are all familiar with. We have other words for it. We call it, let's compartmentalize our problems. You know, I'm going through a divorce and my world is falling apart, but I have to go to work. And if I don't do my work well, then I lose my job and then all goes to hell. So I compartmentalize. That's a name for voluntary dissociation. And it works. You manage to dissociate yourself in doing that for at least several minutes at a time. You don't experience your pain, your suffering, no worries. They are still there. There's a part of you that is experiencing that, right? But the executive ego is dissociated from it. So, yeah.
So I guess the only place in the theory that I would see something that maybe would approach a hard problem, or at least a mysterious transition, is between the kind of conscious states and the extrinsic appearances, like we spoke about before, like why it happens to like metabolism. And we can state that it just does, it has to look like something. But I guess as a scientist, my question would be, in principle, are there methods we could use to gain insight into this relationship? Is it something that's fundamentally mysterious and needs to be stated? Or could there be laws that govern this relationship?
Oh, of course there are laws. It seems to be so stable. No, we all talk about green and square, and we seem to be we seem to have mutually consistent qualitative states in perception. So of course, certainly there are laws. I think what happened is the following. When the first dissociation happened, in other words, when the first living organism arose out of non-life, abiogenesis, the external experiential states would impinge on the boundary of the inner dissociated life of that organism. In the beginning, it probably was something very, very simple, something akin to, well, it's warm out there or it's cold out there, or it's bright out there or it's dark out there, like one bit, or maybe a grayscale between light and darkness, or warmth and cold, maybe a little grayscale of states. And that was the impingement of the external environment on that dissociative boundary of the organism, which would look like a cell membrane. So when I talk about dissociative boundary, I'm talking about the thing in itself. And when I talk about the membrane, I'm talking about what the thing as it's in itself, how it appears to perception. Yeah. So I'll talk about membranes now because it's more familiar. So I'm not talking about the thing in itself. I'm talking about its appearance now. So simple organism with a membrane, the environment impinged on that membrane, and the organism would register that in an experiential state. Very simple, a little grayscale of warmth or cold and bright or light or darkness. And then guess what? Organisms that would collect more and better information about the surrounding environment stood a better chance to survive and pass on their genes. So nature started refining that dissociative boundary in order to collect more information. Now, this is a tricky problem because you cannot simply mirror the states of the world outside. If you do that, you would dissolve into an entropic soup. There will be no boundary to your inner entropy. And I'm not sure that the audience will follow this. How do I?
We can go slowly if you want to unpack it.
If your inner states will mirror the variety of states of the outside world by just reflecting them inside, your structural and dynamical integrity couldn't be maintained because there would be too much variety within you. All that variety of the world outside would be embodied, and you wouldn't be able to maintain your shape, your inner structure. You would dissolve into a chaotic entropic soup. So perception has to walk a very fine line between collecting as much information as possible about those thoughts and emotions and endogenous states out there, but in a way that doesn't make you lose your structural integrity. And I think what nature found out was the best way to do that is to translate those thoughts and emotions out there into a kind of dashboard that would give you a sort of at a glance perspective of what is out there without mirroring all that variety, all of those endogenous experiential states. And this dashboard of dials is perception. That's what perception is. That's why seeing red doesn't feel like being angry. That's why feeling peaceful doesn't seem like seeing white. That's why looking at the sun doesn't feel like falling in love. Because if I'm correct, the transpersonal states out there are not perceptual. They are more akin to thoughts, emotions, inner feelings. So why do we see colors and feel flavors when we look at the world instead of thoughts and feelings and emotions? Why? Because there was a huge evolutionary advantage to encode information about those external thoughts and feelings into a dashboard that would allow you to gather that information without dissolving into an entropic soup. I think that's why the qualities of perception are what they are. That's why your experiential inner life looks to me like the cells of your body, your nervous system, your bones, your stomach, and all that. Because that's what we evolved to see. If we could reverse engineer that process, I think we would have a big clue about what is really out there, what the world is as it is in itself. Because what I'm saying is that the world out there as it is in itself is thoughts, emotions, feelings, is more akin to that than to colors and flavors. That's just representation. Historically, the world's traditions have made educated, intuitive guesses about that. I mean, to mention an example in the West, Dante, I think doesn't require further introduction. The big Renaissance figure from Italy, he said, there was a memorable passage, he says, he compares the stars to an outpouring of love. So his intuition was, what looks to me like the sun is, from a first person perspective, an outpouring of the feeling of love. So that transpersonal outpouring of love presents itself to me on the screen of perception, which was made to encode that outpouring of love. Otherwise, I would dissolve into that love. It looks like the sun. It looks like a bright star. Other equivalences have been in the world's poetry for a very long time as well. I mean, white is universally associated with calmness, peace. Fire is associated with passion universally. Stones are universally associated with robustness and eternity, timelessness. If you take up a book on symbols, on symbology, there are rich intuitions there. Now, of course, none of that was derived from a strictly scientific method, which is a pity, because a scientific perspective into that translation would be very interesting, would be very valuable. We live in a symbolic world. We are immersed in symbols, and these symbols are not the end of the story. They are not the ultimate meaning. They are pointing at something that exists behind them. So it's something we can study, we can decipher. It's just that nobody's bothering to do that.
So in your view, is there a fundamental difference between there's the conscious states that constitutes the organism that you're made of. You're made of feelings and emotions in these conscious states, and they have an extrinsic appearance like a body, eyes, all these things. But then there seems to be, the causal direction seems to go the other direction in perception, where information is coming in through the senses. You now have, and that's shaping the structure of experience. Is that right? Is there a difference between those two?
The way you worded it is quite dualist. It's coming in through the senses and then it becomes mental. I would say, I'll repeat myself, but I found out that the only way to go about this is to repeat myself, because at some point the coin falls. What we call our sense organs are the appearance of a certain configuration of mind. that configuration of mind is the thing that performs the translation between mental states out there and mental states in here. But that translation is in itself also mental. It is not a non-mental thing doing that translation. So the direction of the arrow of causality is irrelevant. It's a mental process doing a mental translation. And that mental process, it's a process. That mental process looks like our sense organs. That mental process is a configuration of the dissociative boundary, which is mental. It's all mental. These are all mental processes, mental states undergoing dynamic mutation. So there is a continuous dynamic mutation in the configuration of your dissociative boundary. So say, you know, you grow up, you get old, things change in your body, and that appears to us as our sense organs doing their work. Does it help? Or
So yeah, no, I mean, I think also I wasn't assuming a dualism. I get that the eyes and everything are made of mind as well. I guess it's I guess what I'm pointing to is there's an interesting, you've got the organism that's made of consciousness, and from the outside it has an appearance, and that looks like eyes. If we take vision, like, I think this, okay, yeah, maybe this is the place to hone in on. If there is conscious visual experience, one thing you could say about eyes is that's what it looks like when you look at something that is visual experience. But the other thing you could say about eyes is that is the dissociative boundary mediating this kind of perceptual, there's a flow. When I was talking about a kind of flow of causality, I'm not talking in kind of dualistic terms, but just that there is information being gathered from the world around to the, across the dissociative boundary to the inside of the organism. And I'm kind of wondering if there are two, what your account of what an eye is, I guess, would be in this case.
I think they are the same thing. Look, your eyes don't end at the surface of your body. They go in, not only your eyeballs, but your optical nerve, and it goes into your brain. So there is no boundary there. Even to talk about an eye or two eyes it's a nominal thing. There is no such separation in the reality of the organism. There are no such things as organs. There are just differentiated segments that for convenience, we say, well, we delineate that and we give a word to one part and another word to another part. But the organism is a whole. Your eyes don't stop right behind your skin. They merge into other kinds of tissues that go into your brain. There's a continuous merging. So the dissociative boundary, for exactly the same reason, because I just talked about its appearance now, the dissociative boundary is also nominal. It's something for convenience, it's to explain what I'm talking about. There is a real effect, dissociation, but the boundary itself doesn't end at the surface. It is a process that goes into the organism as well. So that boundary is in itself a translation process, a mental translation process. You can delineate it for convenience. You can say it ends here. Actually, it's not only for convenience in that case. In the case of the dissociative boundary, there is an ontological reality to that, in the sense that, I can feel what happens on my finger, but if I touch the monitor, I cannot feel what's happening inside the monitor. So there is an ontic, an ontological aspect to that as well. But what I mean to say is that the boundary doesn't stop at the boundary. It goes in. It's what we call the boundary is just the superficial layer of a mental process, a dissociative mental process. So that translation of outside experiential states into what you feel inside is not taking place only at the boundary. The boundary is a delineation, but it's flowing in and being processed all the way until you experience it. Does it does it answer your question? I didn't get it well.
I think I won't stick on it for too long, but I think I'm yeah, the penny's not dropping on something like if I have conscious experience of as humans we have trichromatic vision, right? We have kind of 3 dimensions primarily in color, of kind of yellow, red, and blue as primary colors, and mixes of the 3. And then if you look in the retina, we have these kind of photoreceptors that respond to different wavelengths of light. My first instinct was, well, in your theory, is it that there are mental contents of seeing these three dimensions of color that look from the outside like a retina with these different photoreceptors?
I would call them
You see
mental
what I mean?
processes. So
okay,
there is a mental
yeah, sorry.
process that looks
Yeah.
like cones and all those cells in your retina. Go on, go on.
Yeah, I think I'm just harking back to when we spoke about why why dissociated mental process looks like metabolism. I think there's this mystery that I want to fill in, and maybe I just need to wait centuries for people to do this kind of science to fill this gap. But there's this need to kind of when the arrow flows the other way, and we think of this bottom up dependence of experience on our senses as these physical things interacting with the physical world. Obviously, I've been thinking in that paradigm my entire life, so maybe it's too much to hope that I can flip in a moment. But that's what I'm struggling with, and we don't need to dwell on it much longer if that's not.
No, I'm trying to think what else can I add on. Look, on why life looks like metabolism, I don't think it's complicated. You don't need to wait very long. We talked about it already. It had to look like something. It so happens to be what we call metabolism. But you are looking for a deeper insight. You're looking for the answer to the question, I know how it feels from within. I know how it looks from without. And I grant to you, Bernardo, that it had to look like something. Fine, I understand that. But what is the arrow that connects the two? Why is it exactly that what I feel from within appears to the outside as metabolism? So you're looking for a more in-principle question, right? It had to look like something. I think you accept that. But you're looking for a deeper insight. You're looking for the mechanism of that translation. I would say the mechanism of that translation are your sense organs. It's just that we are so used to mistaking the dashboard for the real thing that it isn't satisfying somehow. We want to dig deeper. Metabolism is the name we give to certain patterns that appear on the screen of perception. In a sense, metabolism is what it is because our perceptual apparatus has evolved the way it evolved. If it had evolved in another direction, the same thing in itself that we call metabolism would look like something totally else, totally different. You understand what I mean? We would be talking about it in totally different terms, yet the thing in itself would be the same. It would still be dissociation. But what dissociation looks like is a function of our sense organs and the way they evolved. I'm not sure I'm helping.
So I think, no, you definitely identified the area that I was interested in. And I think you also used the word insight, and I think actually you pointed to maybe a deeper, the thing that's giving rise to this concern is a feeling of having to sacrifice year after year in science. You feel like you get these insights as to why nature behaves the way it does, and there's this feeling that in this picture of the world, those insights go from being powerful, explanatory kind of stories we can tell that give us insight into the nature of the world to kind of descriptions of the appearance of the world. So like,
I understand.
If we take like dissociation, right? Like I would say, people studying abiogenesis, the beginning of life, there are stories people think in terms of chemistry and thermodynamics and all this physical stuff, right? And I guess what I'm wondering is there an appeal to, should all of the biologists, if they adopted this worldview, are they looking in the wrong place? Should they be looking for a psychological mechanism, or an experiential mechanism that gave birth to life, as opposed to a chemical or a thermodynamic explanation?
I don't think they are looking at the wrong place. I just think they are not looking at all places where there is something to be looked for. It's not the wrong place. It's just not the entire gamut. I understand what you're saying. Look, the dials on the dashboard are correct. They are not wrong. You understand what I mean? What the dials are indicating is true. When you look at the speedometer, it's accurate. It's the correct speed. It's just that a needle on a little needle moving on a round dial is not the movement of the car. It is not what the movement of the car looks like. It's a representation of it, but it is an accurate representation. It conveys valid, important information about what's going on out there. I think it would be crazy to use analytic idealism as an excuse to dismiss perception, to dismiss science. Certainly, I would not do that. And I would violently oppose anybody who tried to do that. The dials are useful. They are the very costly, very painful result of 3.5 billion years of evolution. We would be nuts to dismiss them. But the dials are not the thing in itself. Now, does this make analytic idealism in any sense different than materialism with regards to this? I would say no. If you really understand materialism, you are facing the exact same problem. A materialist who is consistent about his perspective would say, all my experiences are epiphenomenal mental states unfolding inside my skull. They are a representation of something that's out there, the real reality. But that something that's out there is fundamentally inaccessible in any direct way. It's accessible through the representation. So it is accessible, but not immediately accessible. It requires the mediation of epiphenomenal mental states. That's the materialist story. So for the materialist, if you really understand it and you're consistent with it, metabolism, cell biology, all that is also just a representation of something else that we cannot access directly. You are facing the exact same problem. It's actually a worse problem because the analytic idealist can say, what is on the screen of perception is not the thing in itself. It's an accurate representation. The dials are correct. The dials on the dashboard are largely correct. Most of the time they are correct. We can help them with some instrumentation. But what is really out there is not what is on the screen of perception, what is out there in and of itself. But at least the idealist can intuit what it might be like out there. We can talk in terms of an outpouring of love like Dante did. Because we have also endogenous mental states. And although they can be totally different than the endogenous mental states of mind at large, at least we can conceive of it. The materialist cannot even conceive of it. Because for the materialist, what is really out there is not qualitative at all. Therefore, you fundamentally cannot visualize it because any visualization is an arrangement of qualities. So you cannot visualize it. It is impossible to even conceive of what is really out there. So I would say I'm better off than a materialist regarding your point.
Yeah, so I think we've got, so that goes back to our point earlier when I was saying how as a scientist, I don't believe that I don't believe it makes sense for us to make claims about the essence of what reality is made of.
I agree.
The thing in itself. And so I guess what I'm reaching for is that scientific explanations are maps of behavior, of processes, and I feel like they give insight. And then if mechanistically there's something beyond just that process, just whatever it is in itself, that what's relevant to us is the process and the description of it. If there's something like if the living system beyond its behavior, beyond being a process, is mental states, is feelings and all these other experiences, that to me is the thing where I'm like, there's something new has been added here, deeper than just sticking with the descriptions.
Oh yeah.
And then there's the feeling of, now do we have to explain, if we want to explain why life arose, do we now face this psychological explanation of like, how do we understand dissociation? Because that's where that happened, and then the process of what that we call life and abiogenesis happened.
Every advancement in understanding opens up new, broader boundaries of mystery. I would say this is no different. It does open this extra dimension that you're talking about. And I think this is enriching. It is not an extra problem. It's an extra mystery, and it's an exhilarating mystery. You have a background in biology, so you're thinking in terms of what is, quote, behind the body. What are the mental states that are the thing in itself when it comes to a body? But you can invert that direction, not of causality, and just look the other way. What is behind the entire inanimate universe? What is behind black holes, stars, moons, galaxies, galaxy clusters? What is behind a grain of salt? What is behind the storm, lightning, a river, the ocean? There is something behind all that, because now we open up this new understanding that what is on the screen of perception is not the thing in itself. The same applies for materialism, but for the materialist, what is behind it is fundamentally inaccessible. So there isn't even a mystery. I mean, you're defeated before you even begin the fight. It's over. You cannot conceive of it. We can only write equations about it. And those equations are descriptions of the perceptions themselves, not of the thing in itself. With analytic idealism, this boundary opens up. It's not a losing fight. You may lose it, but you have a chance. And the world's traditions are rich in guesses, hypotheses, and intuitions about what is behind everything. And for me, this is I spend most of my time arguing in a very hard-nosed way for idealism, because that's where the culture is. But where I am personally, because what I'm putting across, I live according to what I'm saying. I was going to say, I really believe it, but now that doesn't do justice to it. It's a very calm state. It's not a agitated belief, like I need to convince you so I feel better about my own belief, I feel reassured. No, that's not it. It's very natural, calm, spontaneous. I live according to what I'm saying. It is my reality. And to me, the world is a symbolic book to be interpreted. So everything I see on the news, I like to walk in the mountains a lot. When I'm in the mountains, down in Austria, Switzerland, Northern Italy, France, Germany, you have this higher view on the world, and you see with a lot more depth. Your perceptions gain a whole extra dimension. And in my mind, intuitively, not even metacognitively sometimes, I have that constant little process of questioning. Wow, what is it? What is this thing seeing from a first person perspective? What is the thing in itself that looks so amazing, so overwhelming, so much bigger than I am? I think if everybody would live like this, I mean, I'm not putting myself on a higher level. I mean, God knows I'm neurotic like hell. I suffer a lot. But at least this I have. The world to me is not flat and meaningless. It is deep and meaningful. Even if I don't understand the meaning, I know it's there. And failing to understand it, for me, is not depressive. On the contrary, to be aware of your own smallness is exhilarating in a way.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. This is the mistake that happens when people mistake the map for the territory and think that the world is made of meaningless, inert stuff, and they somehow forget that meaning is real. There's no denying that meaning is real. It's here. It's imminent. And then we can describe laws and how the world unfolds, and then we somehow get confused and think that somehow means that the meaning was never real, but the map never, dismisses the territory. And I think you were talking about this kind of state of contentment and peace with this. And I think that's kind of when all of us, when we try to understand the world around us, I think unconsciously that's what we're going for. We want to feel some sense of groundedness and security. And I think that's partly why I've focused on this one point that kind of unsettles my worldview of this kind of, if there's this mystery, you mentioned it kind of introduced this mystery of the gap between mind and kind of the behavior of the world. And you take something like I would think about the existence of time, right? There's this story that's in physics of Boltzmann, who had this kind of idea of it basically being more ways. This is the second law that we kind of touched on earlier. More ways for things to be disordered than ordered, so that kind of results in time flowing in one direction rather than the other direction. But then in your view, I think, well, all experiences unfold over time. You can't have an experience in an instant. So in this worldview, the mechanism of time must be there at the beginning in consciousness. There must be structure and time. No?
Yeah. No, but I recognize where you're coming from. It's very intuitive, what you're saying. A philosopher wrote about it in Scientific American, I think 2 years ago. She was basically saying panpsychism cannot be true because we know that certain particles are timeless and they're going at the speed of light. So there cannot be anything it is like to be them. So panpsychism is false. I forgot her name. It was a philosopher, not a physicist. But before I try to drag you down the rabbit hole, let me just give some historical context so it doesn't look like I am absolutely crazy. So I have some precedents who said that. Since Kant, the West has been dealing with this idea that maybe time and space are categories of perception. They are the scaffolding of your perceptual processes. They are not objective. They are not out there. Schopenhauer echoed that and said the same thing. Space and time are the scaffolding of representation. They are not the thing in itself. They're not the will. The will is timeless. The will is one and timeless. It was his way of saying universal consciousness is one and timeless and spaceless. I agree with that. In physics, there are people who say that time don't exist. Julian Barbour wrote a book in 1999 about it. The End of Time is the wonderful name of his book. There are other physicists who say time is all there is. What's his name? A friend of Julian Barbour, Lee Smolin. He thinks that space is an illusion, but time is the only dimension that exists. And you have the whole new gang of quantum loop gravity theorists who say that, well, time exists, but it's epiphenomenal. It arises out of quantum processes. It's not a pre-existing scaffolding to physics. Time itself arises, which is now, it's almost a mainstream view in science. The idea that time itself began in the Big Bang, that it wasn't a pre-existing scaffolding within which the Big Bang happened. But your point is more experiential. You're saying experience can only unfold in time. There is no immediate experience without the dimension of time. I will not dismiss this. I will not poo-poo your point of view because it's very intuitive. I think 99 out of 100 people would directly agree with you. But I would invite you to think a little more carefully, a little more deeply about it. And you will realize that there is no dimension of time in experience. Time itself, the concept of time, is an immediate experience. What leads us to talk about time is our memories and our expectations. The memories we link to the past, our expectations we link to the future. But memories only exist insofar as they are experienced now, as memories. If you experienced a memory a second ago, well, that experience is itself a memory that you are experiencing now, 1 second later. Your expectations only exist insofar as you are experiencing them now. You cannot point to the past and say, there's the past. You cannot point at your prior experiences and say, there they are, my prior experiences. No, they only exist insofar as you recall them now. Same for the future. You cannot point there and say, there's the future. I wrote extensively about it in a book called More Than Allegory in part two. Part two of that book, it's about 1/3 of the book. I talk about this idea of time, where it's coming from, what it actually is, what can we say from an experiential perspective. I even got an essay published on Scientific American arguing what I'm arguing to you right now, and against that philosopher who said the opposite, saying that actually there is no time in experience. Our very concept of time is an immediate experience. Now, this opens up a whole rabbit hole of implications and consequences. And and associations in your thinking. And it can lead you to the conviction, for instance, that you may be traveling in time all the time, because it's not really there.
Yeah.
Time is a landscape of the present. That landscape that is stretched out in your mind in the form of memories and expectations. We do this in the now. It's like a big bang that happens in the now. We stretch out the intangibility of the present moment, which is, it's so small, it's intangible. Mind stretches it out into the solidity of a historical timeline. But that stretching out is itself instantaneous. We are not going to get to a comfortable place with this in one interview, but I would invite you, have a look at my essay on Scientific American. You can type my name, Bernardo Kastrup, on Scientific American. There are several essays. One of them is about time. And the title is, Do We Experience the Flow of Time? I like to title my essay.
So I actually agree with everything you said. And I guess I should maybe, instead of conjuring up the image of a linear time that kind of exists, you know, on some kind of, that the past genuinely exists and the future genuinely exists, I guess what I mean is that in the present moment, there's this, there's a directionality. I think this is tied up with the fact that I guess I don't personally see consciousness as a substance that exists kind of in its own right. I see it as this kind of strange flux, this strange kind of relative process. And it's in the change that it exists. It's only a process. You know, I guess if you were to force me to have an ontology, it would be a process ontology of saying it's not hard matter, it's not just mind, it's all flux. You know, you could start with nothing, and then out of polarity and just relative change, there's something seems to be happening, and the thing in itself is mysterious, but there's this flux. And so I see this as being linked to the concept of emptiness in Buddhism, that if you really, we think that red is a thing that we really, you know, it's like a kind of qualia, like an atom of experience. But if you really pay attention, there's not really anything there. It's not made of anything. And so I think that's the thing that makes me kind of, the idea of consciousness as a substance, I guess, it would be my main objection.
I don't think consciousness is a substance, literally, because what is a substance? A substance is something that mind points to and says that exists. But mind is not that. Mind is here. It's that which does the pointing. It's not what is pointed to, but the thing doing the pointing. I think the nature of consciousness itself, I think experiences are excitations of consciousness. You can think of it like a guitar string playing a note. And that's why there is variety of experience in only one consciousness. There are different patterns of excitation of consciousness. One is red, the other one is a bellyache, another one is falling in love. These are patterns of excitation of this medium, which I don't think is a substance. I don't think it's an object. I don't think it's a medium. But language forces me to attribute a noun to it. I have to give it a noun, a name, otherwise I cannot talk about it. But I think what it is in and of itself, when it's not excited, if these things are all possible, maybe consciousness is always undergoing some pattern of excitation. But what it is in and of itself is impossible to know, because it is the one asking the question. It is consciousness that is asking the question, what is consciousness exactly in and of itself? If you want the answer to that question, study the question. Do you understand what I mean? The answer is in the question. It's not going to come. You're not going to derive an answer through steps of logical reasoning. The answer is built into the question, because the answer is the thing asking the question, or the X asking the question. What you said echoes Whitehead process philosophy. It's another way of approaching it. He avoids talking about nouns at all costs. I think the price he pays for that is ambiguity and incoherence. So I don't go down that road. Moreover, it's impossible to talk about it in the culture at large. That's why Whiteheadians are such a small community. So I'm not going to do that. It's a losing proposition. I understand the motivation for that. You articulated it very well, what the motivation for that is. I make a concession for the benefit of reaching people, if you know what I mean. But this is not the question you asked. Oh yeah.
I think it is. That was a wonderful answer.
But
I'm glad I asked it.
you insisted on the part about entropy. There is an arrow of time because the laws of physics seem to
Oh,
be.
we can go back to that. Yeah, yeah.
They seem to be time
Yeah, so actually,
symmetrical.
just to clarify that, yeah, I would say that I don't see time as fundamental in any sense, but I feel like the corner of the universe where we exist as physical processes is dependent on entropy, and that's why experience unfolds. When I say over time, we have to understand that I'm talking about a present moment that's changing. We say change rather than time. And if there was no change, if you take a freeze frame of the universe, I think there wouldn't be experience. But yeah, you can take it from there.
Okay. I think we are in a freeze frame of the universe all the time. but okay. I think time is the scaffolding of perception. It's not out there. Time is in us. We are not in time. I think that's the reality of the situation. Time is in us. We are not in time. We are born. Birth and death happen within us, not to us, if you know what I mean. Now, having said that, obviously there is this illusion we call time. To deny that there is something we call time would be just precious, right? And silly. Even if it's not ultimately real, there is a process happening that we call time, and everybody agrees that that process seems to be happening. I'm not going to invalidate or dismiss that. I think it's illusory, but the illusion is happening. The illusion has a structure. That structure can be modeled. That's why we have T in many equations in physics. Actually, you can write the whole of physics without T, but as Julian Barbour has shown. But if you write it with T, it works as well. And it's easier to understand. So there is something out there that, illusory as it may be, there is a structure to it that is amenable to modeling and prediction. And that is important because, you see, I'm an idealist. I think all is in mind. By saying that, I'm granting ontological reality to illusions. It's materialism that says that illusions are nothing because all that exists is outside mind, and illusion is only in mind. Therefore, you can dismiss it. You can ignore it. No, I think that all that's happening is mental. It's all a kind of dream. And the question is, what part of that dream is consensus, is shared, and what part is idiosyncratic, is you making up stuff in your head. But in essence, the ontological essence of reality and illusion is the same. The only difference is to what degree there is consensus, to what degree it is believed, to what degree is it shared in a culture, in a society, in a group. So I think the illusion of time is very relevant. Its structure and its predictability are very relevant. But I don't think analytic idealism will solve the mysteries of time because it's not science. With the same mouth that I will criticize scientists pretending to be or thinking that science is philosophy and talking nonsense, with that same breath, I would say that philosophers who think they can replace science are full of it. So there are different methods that are better applicable to different problems. I will go as far as to say time is an illusion, but illusions under idealism are relevant. But it's not up to me to solve that illusion. I think analytic idealism inherits that problem, just as materialism does, just as dualism does. There is a mystery to time. There is a mystery to entropy. The laws of physics are symmetrical, but the world seems to go in only one direction. Why is that happening? What is it exactly? What is this business that time stops on the event horizon of a black hole? What is this business that for a photon, time never passes because it's always going at the speed of light? I mean, these are equations that have enormous predictive power. They are pointing at something true. I would like to know that, but I don't think analytic idealism answers it.
So you mentioned death there. I feel like this is a kind of something that is a big maybe appeal for a lot of people of this philosophy, right? What do you think this entails happens to the individual upon death?
what happens when a patient with dissociative identity disorder is cured? What happens is that those split personalities are reintegrated. The memories of each alter are integrated into the memories of the host. And the host remembers the point of view of each alter. It inherits the memories of each alter and recognizes, oh, those were all my memories. I was playing all those roles. It was all me. I just got confused about it, but it was all me all along. That doesn't seem too bad. I don't think the patient, when the patient's cured, mourns the death of the alters. I don't think that happens. The patient realizes that it was all him or her all along. Another metaphor. When you are in a dream, you think you're inhabiting a world. You think you are in the dreamed up world. And you think you are that character in the dream. And then when you wake up, you realize that, oh, I wasn't in the dream. The dream was in me. And I wasn't that character. I was the dreamer, making up the whole thing. You don't mourn the death of your dream character when you wake up. You realize that your dream character never really existed to begin with. It was just you. In more or less the same way, I think this is the realization of the end of universal dissociation, the end of life. You realize that, oh, Bernardo was just a role I was playing. It was just me. You were not going to mourn the death of Bernardo. Concurrently, Bernardo doesn't survive. The alters don't survive. Your dreamed up character doesn't survive. REP to it. Your dreamed up character dies when you die, when you wake up. The alters die, disappear, vanish, no longer are when the patient is cured. I think Bernardo Kastrup will die, vanish, disappear. Thank goodness. Because it's the end of the illusion, and Bernardo Kastrup tends to suffer quite a bit, tends to be very neurotic. The idea that Bernardo Kastrup would go on and on and on for all eternity, I would commit suicide if it were possible under that scenario. So I think our individual, so to give you an answer, I was just prepping the answer. I think our individual identities die. We die, we cease to exist as people, as individuals. We are reabsorbed into that was all along the ground of our being anyway. But I don't think anyone or anything, any facet or aspect of the universe, except the ones that stay alive, will mourn that. It's just, oh, shit, oh yeah. That's what was going on all along, okay. That's
Yeah,
what
I think this revelation of exactly what you described, of this feeling of there was only ever the one mind, and it becomes all these different dissociated identities. I would go so far as to say that's a really archetypal psychedelic experience that me and John Horgan, who you're friends with, spoke on the podcast about how we both had the same kind of experience, and I've heard it from many people. What's your take on what's going on in those experiences? Is it a peak beyond, and what mechanism would allow for that?
You're posing the question to me? Okay.
Yeah.
I will preamble that with a whole lot of disclaimers. I think psychedelic gnosis is very suspicious. I think the information in a psychedelic trip comes encapsulated in layer upon layer upon layer of noise. It's very, very noisy, very, very hard to trust. The trickster is loose in a psychedelic trip. If you come out of a psychedelic trip thinking, hey, man, you know what? I'm actually an alien from the Pleiades. I just dressed up this meat suit, but I come from a planet that's blue, and the period of rotation on its axis is the same as the rotation around the sun. So it's always day on one side, always night on the other. And you have this family, and it is hugely detailed, elaborate stories that come from psychedelic gnosis. I think it's not reliable when taken literally. I think that's your mind expressing itself. That's what mind does. Mind fantasizes. I like to say that the prime directive of mind is to deceive itself. Because if it didn't, there would be no reality. There would be nothing. It needs to deceive itself at some level, in some layer of cognition. Some deception needs to be happening for you to be able to say, oh, there is a world out there. Bullshit, there is no world out there. It's all inside. It's all mind. And I think in a psychedelic trip just exacerbates this prime directive of mind. It will do anything it can to deceive itself. That said, the one thing that is reliably derived from a psychedelic trip, and I think it's not the details, it's not a particular narrative, it's not a particular model or scenario. All of that I think is highly suspicious. I'm not saying it's untrue, I'm just saying suspicious, because mind deceives itself. But there is one thing that's very reliable, and it's behind all that. It's prior to all those models and narratives, and that is the reality of a psychedelic trip is indistinguishable from this reality. If anything, the psychedelic trip feels more real than real. And the conclusion you can reliably take from this is, this too is a mental narrative. This, what's happening right now, this real world of ours, is a trip as well. You can reliably conclude that, I think. I had already concluded that before I tripped for the first time. I was fortunate to have tripped for the first time as an adult. So I could make something out of it. That conclusion you can take. It's all a play of mind, and mind deceiving itself in the trip and right here too. Everything else, I think, is suspicious. Everything else should be taken with a whole bag of salt, not a grain, a whole bag of salt. Any detailed, elaborate, particular narrative about what's going on, where we came from, and where you're going, what's actually happening behind the curtains, highly unreliable. A lot of noise, a lot of idiosyncratic personal stuff motivating that, behind that, but that it is all mental, the trip and this, oh, you bet.
That's really interesting because, yeah, I would say the insight that reality is fundamentally unitive, and the kind of revelation that people can have that it is one cosmic consciousness that becomes all these dissociated identities, they're so common, and they both fit with your worldview. It's interesting that you know, I almost feel like I don't want to dismiss, like, the unitive thing totally fits with my worldview. But I don't want to dismiss them just to, you know, out of hand.
Yeah, I didn't express myself correctly. I don't dismiss that. I think that's the reliable part, that this is all in mind and it's one mind. This is reliable because this doesn't have a particular elaborate narrative about, you know, aliens and fairies and I don't know how many dimensions. And I know people who have these elaborate stories. I have a friend who is very mature, and he doesn't take any of that literally, but he shares with me. He takes psychedelics for cluster migraines, cluster headaches. I don't know what, it's worse than
Headaches,
migraines. Yeah, it's like extreme migraine. It can floor you for a week, and it can destroy your life. And the medicines are almost worse than the thing than the condition. So he takes regularly psilocybin because it gives relief. It's the only thing that gives relief without side effects, without all the other crap. And he tells me the stories, and every time there is a story, and I had these experiences as well. Sometimes you think, oh, I'm in a Borg cube. I visited a Borg cube, a multi-dimensional Borg cube with these colors. Or he talks about, once he talked about a toffee machine. You know, toffee, that caramel-like thing, and there's a machine that sort of rolls that and stretches and rolls and stretches. And he said, I was in that. I was the toffee. I was being rolled and stretched. If you come back and say, that's literally what's happening, I was in a toffee machine and I was toffee, then I think you're making too much or too little of a psychedelic trip. It's deeper than that. To really go in, you have to punch through all these layers of deceptive narratives. You have to keep on going, and then you get to a place which Buddhists call the void. Terence McKenna called, what did he call it? What is beyond the chrysanthemum, he said. Oh, no. Beyond the chrysanthemum are the machine elves. But you have to go beyond
the
the machine.
howling Tao he used to speak about as well.
Yeah, I forgot. But my McKenna phase passed a few years ago, so my memory is failing me now. But beyond all that, there is a place where your personal identity ceases, the fireworks cease, everything settles, everything becomes calm, time and space implode, and you realize there is only one thing going on. And it's me, and it's you, and it's everybody else, but that's the only thing going on. Everything else is a story, a narrative, an imagination, and including this, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with that description. I think that can you can have multiple metaphysics that fit with that same insight of just whatever exists is this stuff of existence, and that's what matters, right? You mentioned the idea that what we take to be normal everyday reality can also be understood to be a kind of hallucination or kind of figment of mind, which is also a kind of a fairly mainstream neuroscientific view now, that I know Seth wrote about and spoke about a lot. And I know you and he kind of got into a bit of a spat over some interpretations of the kind of metaphysical underpinnings of psychedelic research. Maybe that's something we can touch on.
Well, first of all, I admire Anil Seth very much. Not only that, I haven't had the opportunity to interact with him personally, but what I see of him, he's a very likable guy. And my spat was not mostly because of him, maybe because of some of the co-authors. With him, I have the least problem. Although I disagree with most of the response he wrote on Scientific American. I mean, I and somebody else wrote an article on Scientific American, and Anil and other co-authors replied to that. I think he was not accurate in his reply. And many of the points he raised, yeah, maybe they were accurate, but they were beside the point. That was not the point in contention. That was not the relevant thing.
Maybe we can go to what your initial point was, just so everyone's up to speed.
So the main finding consistent in psychedelic research across groups, not only Imperial College, but groups in Brazil, groups in Switzerland, groups in the US, the main finding for all types of psychedelics is that they reduce brain activity across the board. That is the main finding that has been found for psilocybin, for LSD, for DMT in ayahuasca, but independently over a number of years by several groups. I think the latest one is from Zurich in Switzerland, which was the group that originally years ago had arrived at the opposite conclusion, but now they realized that there were some artifacts in their interpretations. There was some caloric bounce back of the brain, and the time the time resolution of their analysis was not enough to differentiate that bounce back from the reduction of brain activity during the trance itself. Anyway, details, but the main finding, a robust finding, is what psychedelics do in the brain is reduce brain activity. And we wrote, I and Professor Edward Kelly from the University of Virginia Medical School, we said, this is not easily accommodated within a materialist framework. Because if we say that experience is brain activity, then an unfathomable enrichment of experience should be correlated with some increase in brain activity somewhere. The information content of a psychedelic trip is orders of magnitude higher than the information content of lying in a brain scanner and looking at it. But yet, the brain activity of somebody undergoing a trance is lower than that of a control sitting in a brain scanner having received placebo. So something doesn't add up for materialism in here. And that's what we wrote. And we went beyond that. I argued, for instance, that the efforts these research groups have been making to find something in the brain that does correlate with the phenomenology of a psychedelic trip, these efforts may be a little bit misguided, because even if they do find something, it would still contradict the rest of the body of work in neuroimaging. I mean, we got to the point now we can do brain image extraction. I know you know what it is, but maybe the audience is not. You can train a neural network with the brain scanners of people who are shown images on a screen. And then the neural network starts finding the correlations between certain patterns of brain activity and the image being shown to the person. After you train that network a lot, you can get a person, put an EEG or an fMRI, depending on the technology being used, or MEG, and you can guess what the person is thinking. Actually, you can guess the imagery the person is playing in his or her mind. You can do brain image extraction during dreaming. You can instrument a subject, and then when the subject wakes up, you ask the subject, describe your dream, and that's double-blinded, so then they describe the dream. And guess what? The researchers would have guessed right what he was dreaming about because of the patterns of activation in his brain. So the rest of neuroscience finds correlations between experience and patterns of activation in the brain. But when it comes to a psychedelic trip, there is no activation, there is deactivation. So even if you find something else that correlates, how do you explain all the rest? How do you explain the fact that when you dream, even of clenching your hand, or when you dream of a statue, scientists can tell based on the activation of your brain what you were dreaming of? Looking at a statue, is there anything more boring? But when you go to Andromeda and you dine with aliens and you undergo your own birth again and you experience 11 dimensions, and you realize you're God, hey, there is not a beep. On the contrary, your brain goes to sleep. Now, nobody on earth can tell me that, oh, there's no problem here. No, materialism can account for this, no problem. It's nonsense. Of course it doesn't. So what these guys are doing, they are, and that's what they argued in their response. Okay, first, what I argue is that what's happening in a psychedelic trip is normal brain activity is the image of a dissociative process in my metaphysics, right? Life is the image of a dissociative process. We are dissociated from the rest of the universe. The image of that is our body. That's what it looks like, that dissociation. When you have a psychedelic trip, your normal brain activity is impaired. It's reduced. My hypothesis is that reduction you see is an impairment of the dissociative process itself. You're making the dissociative boundary more porous, not in your skin, more porous in some other angle or dimension. And there is an influx of transpersonal information. And that's what you will remember after the trip. That's not stuff produced within you. That's stuff that is being experienced outside of you. It's an experience that is beyond the boundaries of your altar. You experience that not in you, but out there in some dimension, if you want to talk about dimensions. And that's what you remember afterwards once the dissociative boundary reconstitutes itself and the psychedelic wears off. Now, so I think that, and it's not only psychedelics that do that. If you breathe too fast, you increase alkalinity level in your blood, the little blood vessels in your brain constrict to protect the brain, and you get less oxygen in the brain, and guess what? You trip. You trip by hyperventilating. People have been hyperventilating forever. Teenagers trip by strangulation, which is highly not recommended. Some of them die, but they make a mistake on this. But if you undergo strangulation and you pass out, you trip. You have a transpersonal experience. Amazing stories. You trip if you are undergoing G-force training in a centrifuge. Pilots have what has been described as, quote, amazing dreams while they are passed out. So the savant phenomenon. Sometimes people are injured in the head, bullet wound or lightning or trauma, an accident, or dementia injures the brain. And they have enhanced cognitive skills and they have transpersonal experiences. Surgery it leads to brain surgery that leaves side effects in surrounding tissue, leads to damage, impairs normal brain function, and people score higher in feelings of self-transcendence. So it's a broad pattern. It's not only psychedelics associating certain types of reduction of brain activity, impairment of normal brain function with enrichment of experience, which to me suggests what I'm saying, that it's increasing the porosity of the dissociative boundary, and those experiences are out there. It's just that you're going out there beyond the boundaries of your dissociation. Psychedelics being just an instance. That's our argument. What they say is that, well, you know what, there is a measure of entropy, or a measure of information of brain activity. These are sophisticated words that mean one thing: noise. That's what they mean with these sophisticated words. I don't think even Anil would deny what I said right now. What they mean is noise. Psychedelics they reduce brain activity, but the residual activity has more noise and more coupling across different areas. In other words, your brain works less like different parts. It works more like one unified whole with a little bit more noise. But metabolism reduces. The metabolism level reduces significantly. So what they are saying is that the psychedelic trance is generated by this more functionally coupled but lower activity noise. That makes no sense. One, if you look at the degree of this shift, it's like point something percent increase in this noise or entropy, or the entropic brain hypothesis, whatever they call it these days. Now, you know, it's a percent change in a measurable brain parameter that is supposed to explain causally a psychedelic trip. I mean, this is insane. It defies belief, not only plausibility. This is beyond plausibility. It defies credulity. But it's the only game in town for the materialist. No, they have nothing else. They have to come up with something along these lines. And moreover, let me make one final point. Sorry, I'm being so verbose about this. Noise, entropy, let's call it noise because that's what it is. It has no structure. That's the point. There is more information, more changes of state in the brain, but without structure. That's why it's called entropy, noise. Now, that noise is supposed to explain a highly, highly structured experience. Psychedelic trips, whatever they are highly structured. It's not noise. It may be a little noise in the beginning, a little noise in the end. When I say that, I said earlier in this interview that it's noisy. What I meant by that was something totally different. What I meant by that is that there's a lot of unreliable information, a lot of things that we cannot rely on. And I called that noise. I'm using the word noise now in a technical sense, in the sense that it is information activity, information changes of state that have no recognizable structure, no recognizable consistent pattern. So that is supposed to explain the highly structured phenomenology of a psychedelic trip. So for yet another reason, it defies belief, not only plausibility. I think we are bound to eventually give up this nonsense, but it may take a while.
I think, I guess you point to this, you're talking about how in a lot of neuroscience research, there are reports of kind of correlations, increase in brain activity with something like dreaming, right? And I think you're right that we're in the very early days of understanding the brain, right? Which is an incredibly complex, or perhaps the most complex object in the known universe. And we start off with these kind of implicit models that are quite simple of increased brain activity, increased richness of consciousness. And because of the kind of social structure of science, those are the kind of things that get published because you find, hey, a positive correlation, let's publish that. And where you don't see stuff and you can't make sense of it because it's too complicated, you don't publish it. So you're right that there's this backdrop of we maybe intuitively expect to see an increase in brain activity, and in the media does a very bad job of I think you criticized this as well in your piece, that it's everything.
In an earlier piece,
they'll take entropy and describe it as an increase in activity, which is not kind of a fair thing to describe. Instead of describing it as kind of increasing variability of responses or whatever. But I think what it says to me is basically that someone like Aldous Huxley was very far ahead of his time in thinking about the brain as a reducing valve. Not, I would say, my kind of metaphysics, not of mind at large, but that the function of the brain isn't to create rich kind of complex experience. It's really, we're embedded in such a vast, complex reality. In order to survive, the job of the brain is to trim everything down and put a lot of effort into convincing you that you are this symbol. I am James, that take all of this complexity and I am this one symbol. So for every moment, through all my senses, all of my memories, everything is getting kind of regulated in a very metabolically expensive way to help me survive. And so what I see is that in the psychedelic state, the brain areas that tend to decrease their activity are certain kind of ones that are particularly involved in these processes, these kind of ones high up the kind of hierarchy, that seem to basically lose control of this process. And you can see this, at low psychedelic doses, you suddenly see the complexity of nature for what it is. You might be fascinated by the structure of a leaf, and you're not imagining that it's really there. It just would be overwhelming if you saw a tree as this unbelievably beautiful fractal display of patterns. So I guess I think of it such that the content is almost there in the structure of reality. It's there playing out through the organism as it interacts with the world, and that it's not that the brain is generating, that you need more kind of energy in the brain to generate more kind of fireworks of experience. That would be the kind of the way that I would think about this. But it's such early days for this stuff that everybody needs to be kind of humble, I guess, when it comes to thinking about the relationship between brain and mind.
Can I make a?
But you mentioned, yeah.
A couple of comments, very, very quickly. I'll try. I completely agree with you that it's early days in neuroscience. Neuroimaging began, 2 decades ago? 3? No, a little over 2 decades ago.
In the 80s, yeah.
Yeah, but not with fMRIs, right? It was EEG. Okay, you'd call that neuroimaging, but it's very low spatial resolution, good time resolution, but spatially can't do much with that. But my point is one of comparison. Whatever you say, the neurocorrelates of consciousness are, and you're a materialist, so you're saying they're not only correlates, they are the causes of experience. They correlate because they cause experience. Whatever you put forward as a theory has to accommodate all the data. If it accommodates some of the data but contradicts another chunk, statistically significant chunk, then you have to sit back and review the hypothesis one puts forward, right? So I understand that neuroscience didn't state definitely that experience is caused by increased levels of brain metabolism. I'm not as naive as they try to portray me, and neither is Professor Kelly, I mean. But we do know that in many instances, in many studies, experiential states that are richer correlate with increased activity. So forget the theory, let's look only at the empirical data. We know that the experiences of our dreams correlate with discernible, measurable, clear patterns of activation. That's why there is brain image extraction. It works. Forget the theory, it works. You can, if I were a subject, they would guess correctly, and I would know that, hey, you are guessing correctly because I know what I was dreaming of or what I was imagining. This stuff works. So if in all those cases, an enrichment of experiential states corresponds to activation, why not in the psychedelic case? Are we postulating two completely different biological bases for experience? If that's what we're postulating, then let's be explicit about that. Let's say that's what you're postulating, and let's see how the world will react to that. But my point is not a theoretical one, it's an empirical. In some cases, correlations with activation are all over the place. And in other cases, it's not. So, you cannot deny that. Don't close your eyes to that, to face the music. That's one point. The other point is, you were alluding to inhibitory neuroprocesses whose job is precisely to inhibit information that is not conducive to survival. It would overwhelm us. We have to be focused on, one, our sense of personal identity, Otherwise, we will not survive. If I think I am the world, I will not run away from the tiger when it comes and eats me. So I have to know that I am me and the tiger is something else. And I have to know that I will end it if he takes a bite on me. So yeah, the brain will focus our attention. These are all metacognitive processes. I even agree that in the beginning of a psychedelic trip, what we are experiencing is a relaxing of these inhibitory processes. If the inhibitory processes relax and reduce, then there is a dimension to experience that comes back to the top, that's not repressed anymore. And that's the complexity of the world that we see, that we experience in the initial stages of a psychedelic trip, or in a subthreshold trip when you take a small dose. But when you are talking about a real trance, and mind you, these guys have given fairly high doses to their subjects. These were, in the early studies, they were careful, but they are giving real doses now. To say that a full-blown, beyond the threshold psychedelic trip is caused by a reduction of inhibitory processes would imply that other processes are increasing because they're not being inhibited anymore. That's the mechanism. If you reduce the inhibition, something else will become disinhibited and it will activate. So you would have to see some activation somewhere, and that's not seen. The one time they have seen that with an MEG, that was a paper from the Imperial College. They used an MEG and there was a tiny increase in the visual cortex, which contradicted their previous results. And they themselves explained that away as an artifact of measurement. Yeah, and you alluded to the media as well. The media has reported these results as the opposite of what they were. They have taken images with clear legends explaining that red means more functional coupling. They have deleted the legends of the original papers. In other words, they have deleted the part that explains what the picture is showing. They reproduced the picture and associated that with increased activations. Oh, look at that brain's red, lit up like a Christmas tree. I mean, it's not only misunderstanding, it's reversing the result. Now, are the researchers to blame? Not for the misunderstanding, but I think they do have a responsibility for correcting the misunderstanding. And I have not seen any effort to do that. Perhaps they were very happy they were on CNN, and therefore, why correct? But I think there is a responsibility, a public responsibility on scientists who are people paid by public money, taxpayer money, to correct such a brutal, unfathomable misrepresentation of their work. But not only that, Robin Carhart Harris has written years ago an essay on the conversation in which he misunderstands his own results. And he says, well, there has been activation in dream-related areas. Well, it was a paper by Tagliazucci, another, Carhart Harris was a co-author. I understand he's not a digital signal processing guy. He's not an expert in Fourier transforms and signal analysis and all that. I happen to have a background in that. So he misunderstood that and he gave an interview. And that interview was copied all over the place. It was all over the media, but not an interview. He even wrote his own essay on the conversation. And once it became clear that that was a mistake, I sincerely expected that he would go at least to his own essay and corrected that. But the last time I looked, which was this year, 6 years after the fact, it was still there with the same outright misrepresentation of a paper in which he is a co-author. Now, I do take exception to this. I think this is disgraceful.
I feel like it's, given the widespread kind of acceptance of materialism, I suspect it's kind of, it's chalked up probably to a feeling of, you know, like it has to be dumbed down to some extent to the audience. And if we say increasing variance or, you know, well, let's just say activation. And, but I understand that obviously this is your whole thing, right? So from where you're coming from, and you see this as a very consequential thing, right? Like that it's important that people are misled this way, so they're seeing the work this way. So I understand that from where you're coming from, it's a crucial issue.
It's not an idiosyncratic perspective of Bernardo Kastrup. It's not my own beef, my own little thing. I mean, this is why materialism is mainstream. This is the reason we live our lives the way we live them. This is why we think consciousness ends after we die. This is why we think that the meaning of life is to accumulate matter, because nothing else exists. It's only matter. So it's the only thing that lasts. So let's accumulate it. You know, it is not my beef. This is highly consequential. It's not innocent. It's not the way you described it. I know it was not your intent, but you described it in a way that made it sound like, oh, it's a minor innocent thing that just trying to not be too complicated. No, this is very significant. It inverts a very important conclusion from a study that has metaphysical implications. Anyway, I'll stop my rant.
Yeah, no, I definitely wasn't trying to say that it was your beef. What I meant was people like you and me we reflect a lot on kind of metaphysical things and meaning and this kind of thing, and that's where our heads are at. I think for good reason. We're both thinking in that way, and so the average, jobbing scientist maybe puts out a press release not thinking what I say about the brain really contributes to widespread cultures like thinking about really important issues.
Forget the metaphysics. It was reported wrongly. Not only wrongly, it was reported as the opposite of what was observed. Forget metaphysics. This is pure science. The responsibility of a scientist to not only produce results, but to communicate them accurately to the people, because science is for the people. Otherwise, science should be a club, not a publicly funded activity. I don't think they can evade that responsibility. What was reported was wrong, catastrophically wrong. It was not only inaccurate, it was a phase shift of 180 degrees. In other words, they reported the opposite of what was found. Not once, not twice, multiple times. And this has been allowed to continue. I think this is absolutely disgraceful. It is a disgrace. Most people who don't care much about metaphysics, who don't spend their lives thinking too much about it, a lot of them do that, or don't do that, however you want to look at it, because they think materialism is a slam dunk, it's proven. Didn't you see the other day on CNN, the researchers showed that psychedelics makes your brain light up like a Christmas tree? Of course, materialism is right. Your brain is generating the trip. It's a drug. It's a material thing. So I don't bother about metaphysics anymore. I just try to have fun, because one day I will die and that's the end of it. This is how it happens. This is how nonsense becomes mainstream. It's lots of little things like this. Well, this is not a little one. This is a big one. This is the atomic bomb of enforcing nonsense as a mainstream cultural narrative. But it's these things happen over time. Not long ago, there was a headline, researchers found the structure of memory. We know how the brain records memory now. And then you go read the scientific paper. What they found is that there is a consistent correlation between the original experience, the patterns of brain activity of the original experience, and the patterns of brain activity of the recall. That's it. But it doesn't explain where the information comes for the brain to reconstitute the original pattern during recall. In other words, whatever they explained, it was not memory. But the headline was, we found out where memory resides in the brain. Now, if you're a casual reader and you read the popular scientific literature and not the scientific papers, which is like 99.99% of the people, you will come out of that thinking, yeah, it's the brain that stores memories. It's the brain that produces consciousness. You see how this is done? I call this stigmergy. It's all these little innocent things, these little attempts to make things more accessible to the dumb, stupid public who can't understand anything anyway. So we're going to lie to them. And it's okay, because they would not understand the truth anyway. This is how it happens. This is how nonsense comes to reign the world. Kierkegaard said, I think the world is going to come to an end under applause from wits who think it's a joke. That's it. This is what's happening. This is how we are digging our own grave and dying the death of meaninglessness that Kierkegaard warned us against. It's by these little innocent things that we explain away as, well-meaning, attempt to reach the public.
Yeah, I mean, what you're pointing to, I think, is actually a really significant problem, even within science, before it even gets out to the public. When you have when scientists have to be successful scientists in order to put food on the table, and you have this kind of financial incentive, it corrupts the whole process in the sense that I feel like every other article I read in Nature, which is revered as one of the top scientific journals in the world, the headline will read something, you read the paper and you think, where did you show the thing you claim to have shown? And it's just a kind of accepted thing now. The title is an overblown claim, as you say, something like, bit of the brain that we thought was involved in memory turns out to be involved in memory, and we've proven it. And you look at it and it's all very much within a certain paradigm trying to kind of prove itself. And I'm not saying anything about necessarily the brain and the mind so much as just this is rampant in science, especially the science of dealing with humans, I think. But maybe a good place to end would be, you said something interesting about, to go back to these transpersonal experiences. And actually, you said lots of interesting things, I won't go touch on them all, but one thing I will touch on is I think an interesting way to think about the function of the brain is not that it's necessarily inhibiting other areas that need to bounce back when they're disinhibited, so much as the kind of entire purpose really is this restrictive function, such that when the restrictive function kind of dies down, you're left with what's always bubbling under the surface, which is the stuff you experience in psychedelic states. And you mentioned, the mind can be very tricky. They feel so novel to us. They feel so much kind of more profound and contentful. But I think we can't underestimate, just sitting in this room right now, there's so much kind of sensory input coming in. My brain's doing so much with it to get rid of the noise. I'm actually open to the idea that you might be unveiling really profound things that don't require a dramatic increase in brain activity. And we might diverge there, but maybe that's not a surprise since I'm a neuroscientist. But I wanted to, sorry, you wanted to
I want to comment on that because I've thought about this through every angle I could conceive. So I already thought about this angle you're talking about right now. Basically, what you're saying is that there is underlying brain activity patterns that don't come into the light of metacognition, doesn't come into the field of self-reflection, the field of attention, because the brain keeps it out so we can, function properly and not be overwhelmed with detail. If that's the case, then the controls, the people who are not taking the psychedelic but are being imaged as a control, that brain activity is there. So that is taken into account in the baseline of control. So when you see a reduction for the actual subjects with respect to the control, because it's always relative, then that thing you're referring to is already taken into account. Even if it's not in the field of attention, under a materialism paradigm, it has to be in the brain. It has nowhere else to be. That underlying activity that we are not metacognitive of, all those details, it can only be in the brain, cannot be anywhere else. And therefore, it is in the brain of the controls. And therefore, it's already taken into account in the baseline. So when they show reduction, it's a reduction with respect to that already.
But it's a reduction in certain areas, right? Like, I think that fits with the idea that it's the restrictive functions that are reduced. But you're right, that if it's there in the baseline and then it's there in the person who's tripping, if you're looking for differences, you're not going to see anything, right?
It's a non-variable. Yeah, so this is a non-variable. It's on both sides of the equation. If you reduced inhibitory activity, then the effect of that has to be a disinhibition somewhere else. And you would need to see that because that normal level of noise is already in the baseline. You would need to see something different from the baseline. Otherwise, getting rid of the inhibitory processes didn't disinhibit anything.
Yeah, I think maybe one final thing to say on this is that there's a kind of in-joke within neuroscience of a lot of people who mock fMRI for being such an incredibly crude method of measuring brain activity. So that's something that I always come back to with a kind of open-minded eye to the future of, like, when we see these hemodynamic changes in blood concentration, the electroactivity in neurons is so tiny, and that I kind of feel like when you see that, you're seeing a wave, and who knows what the hell's going on in the individual molecules underneath the surface.
I agree with that. Sorry to interrupt you,
Yeah,
James.
you go. No, no,
I
this is
have
fun.
been through this for so long now. I have sort of deconstructed this, you know, to a level of hair splitting. I'm sympathetic to that. But look, before I was a scientist, I was an engineer. That's how I came into science, as an engineer. And engineers, there's a difference between engineers and scientists. Engineers only care about what works. They don't care about theoretical purity. If it works as if it were that, it's good enough for us. It doesn't need to be like that so long as it works as if things were like that. So for engineers, it's what works. And I still have that mentality, having been a professional scientist, and my business card had scientist written in it for several years. But I'm still an engineer at heart. Whatever you say about fMRI, however inaccurate it may be, however buggy the software may have been for the first 10 years, which we know now was the case, we know there are many problems to be solved. We know it has to be improved a lot. It's all fine. But as an engineer, brain image extraction works, man. They can correctly predict what you dreamed of, what you were imagining, just by looking at patterns of brain activation. So something in fMRI works, and it relates.
But it doesn't need to be activation. It could be relative change, right? You could decode decreases as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be activation.
Well, it's relative to the baseline of the same patient. So yeah, it's an activation with respect to that baseline.
Yeah, but it could still be a decrease. It could be you could have a structured decrease in activity that could decode something, you know, relative to the baseline.
But if experience is brain activity, but we all agree that a dead brain does not produce experience, right? So zero metabolism is no experience. We also know that a lot of metabolism is a seizure. We know that too. So we know that experience, normal experience, somewhere in between. It's not a dead brain. It's not a seizing brain. It's some patterns of activation. We know that, right? So if you are having a different experience, if there is more information going on in your head with respect to your own baseline, it's got to be activation. I mean, to say that what has reduced is disinhibition, to say that what has been reduced is inhibitory processes is fine. But then you have to catch that which is no longer inhibited. It has to be disinhibited somewhere with respect to the baseline, right?
Yeah.
The logic is not too complicated here. If you, the argument of reducing inhibition only holds insofar as it presupposes that something is disinhibited somewhere. In other words, it's activated with respect to the baseline. So you ought to find that in the same way that we do find that when people are dreaming of statues. And we can guess what people are looking at on a television based on measurements with fMRI. Something in there works, something. It's not complete nonsense. And by the way, I am fine if tomorrow we decree that fMRI should be discarded. It's complete nonsense. But then we have to discard all the evidence for all the putative evidence for materialism that neuroscientists are always alluding to. Now, when they say, oh, materialism is obviously true, neuroscience has shown that it's all about brain activation. Well, if you discard fMRI completely, and then you discard the psychedelic stuff that I am interested in, fine, but you discard everything else. You can't have the cake and eat it too. And that's what you're trying to do consistently in many different ways.
So actually that points to an interesting thing as well that I wanted to ask you about, the mechanism of how a psychedelic acts, right? Like the standard view would be that a molecule, a physical thing, interacts with physical neurons and that produces a change. In your metaphysics, what's going on there? Like what is the chemical, a kind of extrinsic appearance of mind at large?
Yes, of a segment of mind at large. So that chemical, that molecule is what a particular configuration of a mental process looks like on the screen of perception. because we've evolved to encode that way, to perceive it that way through instrumentation. Even instrumentation is perception, because instrumentation only works insofar as you perceive the output of the instrument, right? So we're still talking about perception, enhanced perception, as the case may be. So the chemical is the image of a mental process. Ingesting that chemical means that you're opening a little door in your dissociative boundary, and you are allowing a mental process to go into your alter and fool around with the structure of your inner dissociated mental processes. And my theory would be that what it does when it's fooling around is it impairs the dissociation itself. It makes the dissociative boundary more porous. And that's what we experience. I mean, you probably have had high dose, effective, deep psychedelic experiences. Is it conceivable to you as a biologist that can be produced by the brain, that somehow came from some stuff that you already had within yourself?
I would say yes, but I wouldn't say in a sense of. I would say when I first had my first kind of full-on transpersonal going to another realm kind of experience, that floored me. That's the only thing that really shook my worldview. Nothing in life has shaken my worldview like that. And it took me a very long time to kind of what felt like kind of putting my feet back on the ground and seeing how I could make sense of that, whilst trying to be incredibly hard on myself to not fool myself into just telling myself a story that fitted my existing worldview. But yes, but I think this is why I raise this stuff, because I do think it fits very neatly with your worldview, right? Like I feel like these transpersonal states, you can just take them at face value and say, well, yeah, like it makes sense. This is the structure of the universe. Whereas with the kind of classical paradigm, there's a lot that needs to happen to explain what's going on there.
You see, I don't think the particular information of a deep psychedelic trance is reliable. As I said, I don't think it is reliable. You cannot take that as the truth, the literal truth. But I don't think that is information that comes from me as an individual. And that's the point. I'm still discrediting the information, but that's not relevant to what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it's enormously implausible to me that information, illusory as it may be, has come from my personal self. There is nothing in my life experience, in my elucubration, my dreams, my fantasies, my hypothesizing that comes anywhere near some of the things I have experienced. So yes, I think it's illusory. The prime directive of mind is to cheat itself, deceive itself, but I don't think that was coming from my personal mind. That's not why I propose what I propose. That was the little fruit on top of the cake. I already had an idealist view at that time, but it made the idealism very alive, not a theoretical abstraction, not the product of rational reasoning, but it was like, here, man, here's your idealism, you know? So that was interesting.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much. This has been really enjoyable. Hope we do it again sometime.
It passed very fast. I didn't see the time
Yeah,
pass.
it did. Yeah, longer than intended, but I really enjoyed it. Okay,
Thanks a lot, James, for the great conversation. Take care.